Tiffany. Look at you. Hey, you sexy crew. Hi, Tip. Okay.
Dundee. All right. Well, this is good. Bulgaria. Hey, Georgie. All right. I think we got a good number. Y'all want to go ahead and get going?
Sure.
Everybody ready? Let's do it. Okay. Kia ora, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the 2023 Motivational Interviewing and Beyond. This is a pretty exciting episode we're going to have here for a couple of reasons. But I'll start off by introducing myself. I'm Joel Porter. I'm in Christchurch, New Zealand. It's 8:05 in the morning here, and absolutely delighted to be here with this cast of friends and colleagues. And I'm really excited because we have a new member of our team, and that's Kendall Bond, and she'll introduce herself. And just delighted that she accepted our invitation to come. And I don't know what we do, Steve. We co-host, we do something, facilitate or something, but I'm glad that Kendall's with us. And she's a friend of mine and Steve's, and I guess everybody here for a long time. But welcome, Kendall. I look forward to everything that you're going to bring to this webinar that we do. And the magic and your ideas and your thoughts are going to be fun and entertaining and informative. So that's me. And we'll get going. I don't think there's really any housekeeping to do, but other than, enter your thoughts and ideas into the chat. And if you're working with families or you're working with groups of people and using motivational interviewing, please let us know, particularly if you'd like to come and join the conversation. So how about I pass it over to you, Kendall?
Oh, well, thank you. And I just want to say thank you to Joel and Steve for inviting me to be part of the team, and Angela as well. And so, yeah, I'm really honoured to be here. So I'm a behavioural psychologist and I live in Brighton in the UK. And I work with a variety of different people. So I work with groups and couples and also individuals. And I do a lot of training and supervision and consultancy as well, depending on where we are. And I've been doing MI for, goodness, many years, for 18 years. And I love it. And I'm still learning about it every single day. So it's an absolute delight to be here. And yeah, I've just had my dinner and a glass of wine. So I'm very happy.
Cool.
Thank you.
All right. And you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Ange. I'm based in Cardiff in Wales. My history is I used to work with Professor Rolnick, Steve, back, I think, about 15 years ago, until Steve retired from Cardiff University. And my specialism is in research comms and research management. But here, this is fun for me. I'm tech support, so I'm here to support the panelists. I'm here to support you, the attendees. So if you've got any comments, any questions you would like me to make a note of, I'll be just in the background to keep an eye on things. Thank you.
Chris.
Hey everybody, Chris Wagner. I live in Richmond, Virginia. Been here longer than Kendall's been doing MI, and how it goes. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. Work at a university and do practice and a little bit of research. Nice to meet you all. See you all.
Tyrel.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tyrel Starks. I'm also a clinical psychologist, and I work at Hunter College, City University of New York. And I have primarily been working in a research context. I've had for the last 10 or 12 years have really been focused on developing applications of motivational interviewing for couples. And so I've had a series of studies where we've been trying to sort out that technique and how to apply it.
And Karen.
Hi, everybody. I'm Karen Ingersoll. I'm also in Virginia, but about 90 miles away from where Chris is, near the Blue Ridge Mountains. I'm actually sitting here looking at a mountain right outside my office window. So I feel very lucky today. We have a beautiful blue sky day. I'm also a clinical psychologist, just to heap on, by training. I'm a professor at the University of Virginia. And I work mostly with people with medical conditions as well as mental health and substance use issues in either an HIV context or in the context of women's drinking that might affect a pregnancy. Those are sort of my research loves. And for many years now, Chris and I have been working together on concepts around motivational interviewing groups. Because as we started training motivational interviewing many decades ago around the Commonwealth of Virginia, one of the first questions people would ask is, yes, but could you do it in groups? And so in order to answer that question, we had to work that out, and we continue to work that out.
Cool. And last but not least, of course, Steve. Can you say hello and introduce yourself as you get your stove fixed?
Talking about me.
I'm talking about you, brother.
Oh, thanks very much. I've escaped the world of cleverness and work, and I've gone feral, and I'm up in a hut in deepest, darkest West Wales. But I've got a wonderful solar panel on the roof, so I can connect with you. And I am truly astonished how widespread is the need for constructive conversations in group settings. I'm working mostly in sport, and I cannot tell you how much of a struggle it is for coaches and other people to manage groups. And in the absence of skillfulness, they recede into patterns that are far worse than anything I've seen in criminal justice or healthcare. So anything we can come up with that is constructive and simple, not too jargonized, would be incredibly helpful. So thanks very much.
Cool. All right. We didn't intentionally stack the deck with psychologists. It's just that this is the way it ended up. And, you know, more than like 6 or 7 psychologists make me kind of nervous. So I'm glad we hadn't hit that level yet. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to just jump in. I mean, I don't have a lot of preferencing other than, you know, I've done work with, I've been with Karen and Chris and trained with Chris and doing MI in groups, and I've run those workshops, and I've run groups with utilizing their model, which we're going to hear more about as we get going. But I remember, I forgot where I met you, Tyrel. It was at one of our MENT conferences where you were presenting some of your initial work that you had done with motivational interviewing with same-sex couples. Maybe it might have been Berlin or somewhere, but anyway, what I wanted to do is because I want to know more about what you've learned over the years. I want to kind of open up with you talking about kind of working with couples, why motivational interviewing, and how you have woven that into couples counseling and what you found, of course.
Thanks so much for letting me start. I think it might have been New Orleans actually where we had that conversation. But thanks for letting me start. This is an amazing group, so I'm happy to lead us off. So what have I learned? I jumped into my career at sort of an interesting moment. It was 2009, and this paper had just been published that suggested that as many as 2/3 of new HIV infections were being transmitted between men who were in established relationships. And there was all of a sudden this paradigm shift in HIV prevention where people started thinking about relationships. And it seemed really logical that motivational interviewing had such a place at the table in terms of developing substance use and then related HIV prevention interventions. It seemed crazy to not think about some way that motivational interviewing could be part of that. But it also became pretty clear that there had been some challenges anytime motivational interviewing had been tried with couples. And I think what I have spent the last 10 years thinking about is how to meet that essential challenge. And one way to understand the challenge is, what do you do when the two people in a relationship don't feel the same about change? One person thinks drinking is just fine, and the other one thinks they should dial it down. One person wants to be monogamous and not have sex with other people. The other person wants some sort of open relationship. One person thinks PrEP is a great way to prevent HIV. The other person thinks that it's concerning and there are side effects. What do you do when the people in a relationship don't see change the same way? And for a while, I actually thought Karen and Chris were going to have my answer, because they had been figuring out how to make motivational interviewing work with groups. And the problem is, as great as their framework is, it's not quite the right framework for couples. And the reason is, in a group, we often assume that the group members are pretty independent of one another. And if one person in the group decides that they're going to move towards change and someone else doesn't, they have the ability outside of the group to enact change pretty independently. And the group leaders may even have some control over the group composition. But in a couple, whether we want to or not, we can't decide who's going to be in a relationship with who. And also, couples, the partners in a relationship influence one another in all sorts of ways outside of the session. And so we needed some framework for thinking about working with a couple that could accommodate those pieces that are really unique, that two people in a relationship, it's not just a group comprised of two people. They actually operate quite differently. So we thought a lot in terms of interdependence theory to try to understand the way that people influence their relationship partners, the way that being partnered changes the way we think about our health behavior. And I guess when I think about those elements of how partners influence behavior, I think about kind of an internal and an external route, right? So partners may do things to deliberately influence our behavior. They may remind us to take our meds. They may tell us that we've had a little too much to drink. So partners can do things directly to influence us. And then also, relationships sort of get under the skin and become a part of our identity, so that I begin to think of myself. If I were to tell you who I am, part of my answer is I am somebody's husband, I am somebody's spouse, I am somebody's partner. That becomes a piece of me. And the more it becomes a piece of me, the more I am willing to think about my partner's needs and the good of my relationship when I am starting to make decisions. And Steve, there may be some intersections here with your work with teams, that the more being a member of a team becomes a part of my identity, the more I'm willing to think about it as I'm considering the consequences of my behavior. So to stop rambling, the thing that we settled on, or that we realized, is that when a couple feels differently about change, there's no right way, there's no great way to evoke change talk. Because if you just use tried and true individual MI skills and you're talking to two people who feel differently about a behavior, you're almost guaranteed that the utterances that would get you change talk from one of them will get you counter change talk from the other. And so the thing that we moved towards was that first we have to help the couple find consensus. First, we've got to look for common ground. And then once you can find common ground, then you can think about eliciting change talk. So there's this, the idea of sort of dancing with a couple is this process of bringing us together, finding consensus, and then considering change. And that is sort of, I think that idea of the balance between finding consensus and considering change is something that I now find myself thinking about much, much more than I was initially.
I wonder if you could say more about the common ground. Just elaborate on that.
So I guess there's a few ways that I could maybe say more about that. One is that, so in the same way that in an individual motivational interview, one way to generate motivation for change is to get people to think about how their behavior impacts their broader goals and values. So to sort of dial out and think about how drinking might impact your values, or about how the decisions you make around sex and sexual safety may intersect with your broader goals and values. When partners in a relationship disagree, I often find myself inviting them to dial out and to think about their broader goals and values. Because even if two people want to handle sex with folks outside of their relationship differently, even if two people disagree about the best way to prevent HIV infection, or how to look after your health if you're living with HIV, even if two people disagree about what they want to do around drinking or substance use, there probably is at least some chance that they have some common ground somewhere, that ultimately they both agree that they want to stay HIV negative, even if they disagree about the exact best way to do that. Or they agree that they both want to stay healthy, even if they disagree about how much they need to take their HIV meds. Or they know that they need to take care of their finances. They may disagree about drinking's effect on that. But that sort of dialing out and looking for some common ground that we may need to find by getting these two people to think about what ties them together in the first place, right? What is your relationship grounded in? What are the two of you trying to do together? And then to work backwards from those values that you both share, from those things where you do see eye to eye, to then get you to imagine or to consider the impact of your health behavior, whatever the target is, on those things that we know are common ground.
Can I jump in? Oh, Chris, you've just unmuted, so go for it.
No, I didn't unmute to talk. I just was saying, yay, thank you very much. That really helped me understand more. It's
so interesting what Tyrel is talking about, and there's a lot of people commenting in the chat as well. And one of the things that I'm fascinated by is about when we move from creating that connectivity and moving from otherness in relationships to connection, and that being part of the engagement process before you can move into the evocation of a change towards a direction, not just in themselves, but in the relationship as well. And I just wondered if that's something that has to be considered too.
So it does. And actually, when I talk about motivational interviewing with couples, I talk about an additional process that is unique to working with couples. And it is what I call facilitating dyadic functioning, which basically is this idea that you just spend some time inviting these two folks to think about what works about this relationship, what they value about this relationship, what they respect about their partner. I think I was just training some folks in South Africa, and I ended up saying quite a lot during that training that, like, in some ways we don't want to run too fast towards a problem. If we run too quickly to explore a problem, there's the danger that we get there without knowing what we have to work with. And so before I try to focus with a couple and to identify, you know, exactly what the target behavior is and what sort of our goal here together is to do around it, before I focus, I think about spending some time merely having this couple tell me, and by extension, letting them hear from one another, what it is that they value about this relationship, because that's the stuff that's going to help get us through the hard pieces. Karen and Chris, I imagine that there's probably some similarity there to sort of the formative process of sort of group cohesion.
Well, yeah, you know, when the group is first forming, part of what you're looking for is, you know, whereas you have in the couple the story of their relationship, right, that they share together. In most groups, you've got a bunch of strangers coming together. And part of what you have to do is start to reflect on similar themes or ideas that maybe come up as group members go around and introduce themselves and talk about what they're, why are they there, or I think in better groups, you might start out with something similar to goals or values, you know, sort of higher order, not too personal, not too threatening to share in a group, because you want to make sure it's going to be a safe experience for people. And only once group members start to get to know each other a bit and they're connecting on some of these larger themes, then you start to look for or allow more talk about the problems, right? Because most people are coming to a group or coming to couples therapy because there are problems.
I'm not surprised by that. And it actually makes me sort of happy that these concepts of like cohesion formation or like seeking consensus before you think about eliciting change talk and like cultivating cohesion before you end up exploring problems. I have sort of a growing hunch that those big picture processes are probably common to most applications of MI where you're trying to work simultaneously with more than one person.
Yeah, because it has to be a safe experience, whether it's 2 people or 10 people. And, you know, starting off with the human common experiences that people have, instead of immediately rushing to the problem, just like you were saying, Tyrel, with a couple, you want to, the group members don't necessarily have relationships with each other. You know, in a couple settings, they might, like if you were doing inpatient psychiatry groups or something where all the folks are there because they're having kind of severe psychiatric symptoms and they're in a milieu together. But most of the time, that's not the case. Most of the time, there's really no relationship between folks, and you're trying to form the safety net of some shared humor, some shared positive experiences, things they enjoy, to get the ball rolling with conversation, so that when people do have to bring up the tough stuff, the reasons that they're there, they feel safer because they've already had a chuckle with each other, right? Or you can see, you know, group members across the room kind of making eye contact because they hear something in another person's story that resonates with them, and they start to feel safer. Oh, maybe this is a place for me.
Hey, Chris and Karen, and I'm sure people are really interested in this, and I know there's a whole book on it, but is there a way you could describe the model of motivational interviewing in groups in terms of the way that y'all have pulled it together? Because I think people are, you know, to take it from the abstract to something that's has a little more clarity around it. So why am I in groups, and what's one way of doing it?
Karen, you seem really on a roll, so I'm happy to get back.
Well, I don't want to take up all the space either. I'm happy for you to jump in.
Space on, space on. Oh, so one of the things that Karen's better at me is in a group with silence and waiting. Okay. We'll see here. So I think, I've been really interested in listening about couples, and I was thinking about this kind of dimension from interdependency that you're talking about, Tyrel, to independent participants. And it's true that most of our group work has been more on the independent participant side. And for me in particular, a lot of work that I've done in recent years is kind of general adult outpatient mental health practice, where and I live in a city, so people generally don't know each other, don't have even any outside contact. Worlds don't overlap at all. But I know when people do groups in smaller communities, that's not necessarily the case. And so that's kind of moving over a little bit. And I was thinking too, some of the things that Karen already mentioned. I remember once early on, we were trying to sort some of this out. And Karen, you'll probably remember this. We were at a clinic where there was a couple, it was an HIV care clinic, and a couple, and they both wanted to be group participants. And we kind of wrangled with that issue for a little bit of, could we bring a couple inside a group that was otherwise independent? And Karen, I know you'll remember, we were doing a group in a perinatal addiction residential treatment center. Oh. And there were, various issues in the residence. Of course, people live together, and so you can be as independent out in the community as you want, but when you are living together, the things that happen in group lead over to life together, and you start to get some of that interdependence. And I live in a city, but it's a relatively smaller city, and so some of the people in the treatment center knew each other from, as they said, out on the street. And at one point we had a situation where two of the women were telling their stories in a group, both talking about the guy who'd gotten them pregnant, and one was in a relationship, and one was, somebody who said, I was with a guy who was in a bad relationship, so he was trying to get out, but hadn't, you see where this is going, right? So at the moment that they both figured out that they were each pregnant by the same man in our group together, it was an interesting bit of interdependence to kind of navigate our way through.
Well, not only that, but the reaction of the other group members who immediately chimed in with lots of advice for both of these women to chuck him out of their lives, right?
So it was a moment of potential violence, which we have to work sometimes on, and it ultimately ended up resolving itself with the two of them becoming roommates and deciding when they moved out they were going to live together and make this guy work multiple jobs to pay for both of the kids, and neither one were going to have him in their lives otherwise, I believe, is how it ended up. So Joel, I'm sorry that wasn't an overview of MIN groups, but it's kind of where my brain was going listening to Tyrel. So
that's more like a cautionary tale about group member screening, Chris.
It's just, but it was really interesting to think about this interdependence, and because we're often starting from a place where people are independent, will remain independent, but we're trying to create within the group a sense of mutual exploration, mutual outreach, and mutual dependency in a way, not necessarily for what happens in their lives outside, but within the moment. And you're starting from a place where that's already there, and while you're trying to capture it, you're also maybe trying to pull that apart just a little bit and get some space, it seems like.
Yeah, I think, sorry, folks don't mind if I jump in for a moment.
Yeah, jump right in.
There's a couple things I think in your story, Chris, that I'm realizing, and one is that part of doing MI with more than one person means being willing to jump in to help sort of moderate these conversations. That was always O'Leary's. O'Leary was sort of the Carl Rogers of couples therapists, and he talked a lot about the moderating function of the interventionist, that you have to be willing to get in and disrupt patterns of conversation that could otherwise sort of become very, very unproductive between the couple. And you gave us, I think, one extreme example of a moment that probably required a certain degree of moderation from the group leader. But I think there is, when I take people who've been trained to do very good individual MI work and they start doing couples work, they often start feeling like there are moments where they're kind of inserting themselves into the conversation in ways they might not with an individual, but when you've got more than one person in the room, they sort of need that from you.
Yeah. Yeah. So well, I see David Rosengren's on here as a participant. I think when we were initially starting back, when I say it, Karen, in the 1990s, David had already had some work and we borrowed that, and a guy named Craig Noonan, and maybe there were a couple other examples out there that we were pulling to try to figure out how to do this in groups and not mess things up too badly. But I think, everyone on the webcast is at least generally familiar with motivational interviewing, and most of MI translates really well to a group environment. I think the spirit is just right for a group, from my perspective, to really build a good climate at the very beginning and start to build cohesion right from the start. And I've seen people do it different ways, kind of teaching the group members some of the ORS skills, the open questions and reflections and summaries, and otherwise, others just modeling it. I generally just model it and don't really get into that unless there's a particular purpose to with the group. If it's a communications group, we might get into that. Unfortunately, one of the parts that I think doesn't fit particularly well is the idea of interviewing. And since that's half of the name of motivational interviewing, that is a bit of a challenge, in that, what we're really trying to do is facilitate conversations between people and building toward motivation for all to change on the things that they're working on, without necessarily spending a lot of time really interviewing in kind of a traditional sense. Although, Steve, I can almost hear in the back of my head this idea of looking at things together as an alternative way to think about interviewing. There's a challenge in that in a group, any given person doesn't have as much floor time as when you're doing one-on-one work, or I imagine even couples. In a typical group length, somebody may speak 5 or 10 minutes total in a whole session. And so some of our work from the beginning was thinking about how can we get the essence of MI and tweak it in a way that even when people aren't speaking, we can do our part to help bring them along on a change process. And so that's, at first seemed like a challenge, but I think over time has felt like a gift to me. That, now when I do MI one-on-one, I feel so responsible, because the only real place for inspiration to come is from the client's story, since MI isn't really a style where we're teaching or doing a lot of self-disclosing. There's a lot of technical work to work with the details of the story, where when you're in a group, there's inspiration all around. Other people struggling with issues, seeing people make changes that they didn't know that they could, or even try and struggle with it, is just such an uplifting kind of experience for people in groups, that I feel like our job is just getting the group going and tweaking a little bit here and there, and then the group does a lot of the work that I feel like we're left with the responsibility to do when we're doing one-on-one or dyadic MI.
I do agree that the power of the group lies within the group and not necessarily with the group leader or leaders. But part of how you get that inspiration and that set of group members looking to each other and enjoying each other's stories and learning from each other and wanting to help each other is by starting things off well. And certainly there are better and worse ways to start groups, right? And, typically we've been very careful. I saw a comment a minute ago flow by from Nava in Israel about what about the group member who, as soon as they get into the group, start telling their deepest, darkest secrets, right? And that's actually a catchphrase I use a lot in group is, I will say right up front to the group members, if it's the first session, today, we're going to keep things a little bit light. We're not going to delve into anyone's deepest, darkest secret today. And that usually gets a laugh and a little bit of relief from people, right? Because some people don't know what the group is going to be like. And really try to ask the group to tell us some things that are on the positive side. I mean, obviously they're coming for therapy. There's something going on, something that they think is wrong in their life. But it's totally acceptable and actually, I think, recommended to start with the positive parts of humanity that are in the group so that folks can start to see each other as people, not just as other problems, right? And start to realize, oh, I have in common with her something like this, and with this guy I have this little thing in common, and oh, she likes something that I like. It gives you a really positive flowing energy to start the group, and especially because many people in the US at least are mandated to go to certain kinds of treatments, often delivered in a group, and they're usually not coming totally willingly and happy to be there. Right. And so it's a bit of a lift and a surprise if you start off with this more positive, positive memories, happy things from their life, dreams and goals and hopes, as opposed to, I'm Karen, I'm an alcoholic, and, my relationship has fallen apart. And that's a horrible way to start out a group, frankly.
I'm thinking already we've sort of identified some common themes and processes, and there may be a few others that are worth sort of naming. One that we've already talked about is this idea of like beginning with what works, and then also the sort of cultivation of cohesion among the people that you're working with. The other thing that I think has been implicit in this conversation, but maybe worth saying for folks who are listening, is that sometimes just in speaking casually, the word dependence kind of has a negative connotation to it. Being dependent on someone is maybe not such a great thing often when we say it. But when I think about people in a relationship being dependent on one another, or people in a group coming to be dependent on one another for the support that's provided there, I'm not actually saying something that's bad. Or at least I'm certainly not saying something that is inherently bad. Dependence, as I think about that term, simply means that you rely on someone to make things that you want to have happen in your life. And that isn't inherently bad, right? There are ways that dependence can become problematic, especially if there are power imbalances and whatever. But in many ways, the idea of relying on one another in order to make good things happen is not inherently problematic. And I think both what I do with couples and what you all are doing with groups sort of takes that stance that dependence is not a bad word. The other thing that's implicit in what you're talking about, and that also I have really seen the need to do, is to either implicitly or explicitly build in communication enhancement components. I have spent a lot of time thinking about how to do strengths-based communication skills training in a way that is very MI consistent. So we have the couple talk about, when they're successful at talking through things they disagree about, when they run into challenges and what works for them when they meet those challenges. There almost always has to be some component where you're sort of cultivating the working alliance between the two of them in a way. And I think that we're sort of talking around that, and I just kind of wanted to make that an explicit part of this conversation, that communication has a place at the table in these multi-person interventions.
And I think those two tie together. You're communicating ways to help build. Is mutuality a better word than interdependence? I was trying to listen to your comments about dependency having a negative connotation to it. And then thinking about Steve talking about teams, and that seem kind of somewhere between in some ways on if there's this continuum from independence to interdependence or mutuality. So Steve, I wonder if you have things you might share about your work with the teams, groups of people that are actually in a relationship and working toward a common goal already together.
Yeah, if I look, Chris, if I look back on the decades, we started off in MI with a specialist therapeutic orientation that in those days was focused on addiction. And one view, I'm not saying it's the only or the best one view of the journey has been one of stepping outside and beyond into wider areas of application, because we recognize that a lot of what we're working on in MI is happening naturally, or at least the problems people are tackling out there in all sorts of circumstances are readily amenable to the kind of wisdom that comes from MI. So, listening to this conversation, I'm conscious of the fact that in my little world at the moment, working in sport, but it's the case in my work in education and other settings, groups are ongoing. They exist naturally. People are usually dependent on each other because you're lumped together. There's usually power imbalance built into it. I mean, I'm thinking of a sports team, but it could be in any organization. People are mandated to sit in that meeting. You got a meeting and you have to attend. And they know each other and they hate each other and they love each other and they would rather not be there. And some of them would really like to be there. And many of them look, so that's pretty chaotic, what I've just described. And what I've noticed is that the folk who are running these meetings are not trained to get the best out of the people, whatever the setting. So I'm just listening to this and, wondering what Chris and Karen's third edition will be of their book. If the second one is still, solidly MI people coming into a group who don't know each other. The incredible potential of bringing the wisdom of what you guys are talking about into these other settings just blows my mind. So I'm listening to this and thinking, wow, well, that can be useful, but someone's got to do the translational work. It's not going to be me because I've gone feral, as you know.
Steve, there's really something to what you're saying, because, whether it's a sports team or a group or a couple, part of what has to happen to make things work well in the therapy or the conversation is that connection, right? Is helping them to feel connected, not only to you potentially as the group leader or the therapist, but also, or the coach. It's to feel connected to each other as well, and to start to develop that identity of, oh, we're in this together. And even though I may not like this thing about him or that thing about her, we're kind of in it together, and I see ways that they can help me and I can maybe help them, right? And one of the healthiest things that happens often in a group is when one member tells another member how something that they heard the other member say helped them. That is like the gold in the mine. When you're working with groups, because all of a sudden those two are very deeply connected, and one's expressing gratitude for the other, and the other one probably hasn't had enough of that in their life, and they now feel like their heart is, has gotten big like the Grinch's heart, right?
Yeah, that's just super. You see, these are little jewels which are worth picking on. I'll only add one more thing, is that in my little world of sport, they're moving physically. The group is moving physically through space as time unfolds, and yet they're operating as a group. It's another story, eh?
An aesthetic story.
Well, and actually, it's a well-known thing in groups that if your group is kind of stale and stagnant, get them up and move, switch chairs around, right? Rearrange the group, or, divide them up a little bit and give them a little duo exercise. These two go over there, these two go over there. The physical movement can have a really sort of naturally healing effect. So I'm not surprised at all that in sport, where people are always moving, and often, depending on the sport, have to move together in a very kind of structured and flowing way. That's where you can get a lot of important connections. And, the other concept that this brings up for me that Chris and I are going to talk about more in this new edition of the book is momentum, right? Building momentum towards change. And that can happen for an individual, but it certainly happens, I'm sure, in couples, Tyrel, and also in different kinds of groups.
In my mind, I'm kind of thinking of this as an MI, a practitioner, and thinking, how do I, as Steve was saying, how do I translate what y'all are talking to into motivational interviewing? And Karen, what you were just saying about building momentum and looking at the 4 processes of MI is you're moving in towards that evocation part of things where, you've kind of gone through a lot of the preparatory kind of change talk kind of stuff, and people are building momentum towards making a commitment and moving towards change. Would that be fair enough to say?
Well, sometimes it doesn't seem that obvious in a group because a lot of it is interior. So while one person might be talking about a change, another person in the group is listening and maybe feeling inspired by that, and they're moving forward in their own momentum towards change. Or sometimes they're feeling intimidated, like, "Ooh, I'm not there yet. I'm not ready." Or maybe even they feel less than because they're like, "Oh, well, how come she's changing so quickly and I'm still stuck?" Right? So part of what we want to do is be mindful of those differences. Almost always in a group, there are going to be a few members who are lagging behind the others in progress. And, part of our goal as a facilitator is to not let that person get left behind. Or feel left behind.
And I'll say one more thing, and then I'm really interested in what Kendall has to say and where she's at with this conversation is, so what does MI bring to the table in these situations with teams and couples and groups? Because we're talking a lot about process, but what is it that MI brings to the why MI?
There was a book written, and I can't remember exactly what it was called, but it was talking about people who go into therapy. They don't necessarily go in for the answers, but they go in to have the person's calm nervous system. And sometimes when I think about why MI, I think about that MI as a clinician helps to keep me in a safe nervous system space. And that whether that's working with individuals, groups, or couples, that often people will mirror that if we're comfortable and authentic in that space. And I think that motivational interviewing can really help us as clinicians be able to stay out of that polarization and out of that, like certainly with couples and with complex conversations. And also when you're in groups, how easy it is to step it towards people that you are activated by. That you always have some people in a group that you'll be more connected to, and it almost holds you in that space of safe neutrality as a facilitator, both with couples and with groups. And I think that's where MI can really be a beautiful approach to use. I don't know what you think to that.
Yeah, oh, I definitely think MI helps to emotionally regulate the therapist, particularly because I'm trying to so much empathize and better understand what's going on with somebody else. Absolutely. Particularly people that they get anxious and nervous, or there's a lot of emotional energy in the room. Absolutely. Or tension in the room.
Can
I think it,
Kendall, can I ask you, there's a wonderful question here from Palmyra Brown saying, what is the panel's favorite open-ended question to ask in a group? It's wild. I love it.
That I don't, what stage are we at with the group? Like there's so many questions that I could ask. First of all,
We're the first session of the group. Everybody's sitting down and everyone's looking at you as the therapist going, okay, what next?
What would you say?
How are y'all doing? I have to think about that.
Pressure is on with favorite. That's like a key word, but
Yeah.
you know, how can we best be together? I mean,
Yes.
what will be the most helpful for each person here for us to do and not do? I mean, I don't like ground rules and stuff like that, but I like to have a conversation about, you know, how can this be an environment that is, you know, the best for anyone? And that obviously usually means safe enough for people to get involved, but it means not so safe that people don't want to put things on the table that are maybe a little risky or, you know, that they're struggling with.
One of my questions, I love that actually, Chris, that you don't like group agreements. So I'm quite a fan of contracting within groups, depending on the type of group that you're doing. But one of my questions would be, how best do you want to show up in this group? And what part of you do you want to bring to this group? And I think that what you've just shared there is a nice way of holding that space as well of what do you need. Karen, what would be yours?
Well, I guess I keep thinking about humorous aspects of starting a group. And the last few times I did a group, it was a healthcare setting. And, you know, I would sort of jokingly ask near the top of the group, you know, how many of you want to be put on the spot today? You know, to sort of demystify that fear that people come in like, oh my God, I don't want to be the first one to talk, or oh, I don't want to be the first one to say something really personal or embarrassing, or, you know, so just, and of course, laughing and making sure the group gets it, that it's sort of a joke, and, you know, following it up with, you know, in my experience, people have a range of reasons to come to groups and a range of reactions to being here. And one of those might be, some of you might be feeling really nervous. Others might just want to rush ahead and tell your story and get it over with. You know, that also usually gets a laugh. And that process will calm people down a bit, because they're like, oh yeah, we're just all humans in this room together. You know, we're here for some reason, but we don't have to spill our guts right now.
I think Tyrel's tried to been jumping in a few times here. You're so polite.
Thanks. No, so I wanted to go back just slightly one topic and think about this question of why motivational interviewing. Right, like that. Yalom has a very lovely book on how to do group MI, and there are lots and lots of different schools of couples therapy that were around. And so this question of like, do we really need an MI for couples? Like, what is that doing for the world? And so I think I thought about it a fair bit. And I think some part of it is that MI has a lot to offer the counselor in terms of sort of mindset and hard set and regulation. I also think, at least in the couples world, there is something unique about where MI with couples lives. There are quite a lot of couples therapies where the end goal of therapy is essentially relationship quality. People may come in the spirit of, we're worried that our relationship is falling apart, we may be headed towards divorce, we're going to end this. And the therapy is designed with the idea of improving relationship quality. That's great. I don't have any objections against that. It's a lovely end. But that's not a great vehicle for thinking about how to support individual behavior change in the context of working with a couple. And then there are some paradigms where people have tried out substance use treatment and they've involved the partner, but they all sort of assume that there's one person who used substances and the other one who doesn't. The thing that I think has been unique and that MI has offered a way to think about is that in MI with couples, we're thinking a lot about the couple's functioning. We want to draw out and highlight what works about this relationship and what you value about this relationship and what you bring to one another and how you can work together more effectively. And we're doing all of that in order to help you support one another towards some behavioral goal, whether that is HIV prevention or HIV care or substance use treatment or whatever. I think in a way, MI with couples was the first approach to thinking about couples that positioned relationship functioning as a mechanism or as a vehicle to help people then accomplish individual behavior change. And I wonder if in a way, MI with groups did something sort of similar in the way you positioned the provider's role in terms of cultivating sort of cohesion and then evoking change talk and momentum for change.
What I think one of the things I learned and continue to learn from MI is that the world really doesn't need many more experts. And, you know, Steve always talks about don't be too clever. And, you know, the issue in groups is a lot of that, like everybody's heads are busy. Everybody has some sort of hope for connection and bonding with other people and also fear of it and histories of attachment problems, all, you know, lots of complicated stuff. And what I learned from MI is that stuff can be really important, but it doesn't mean it has to be what you talk about. That what we're really trying to do is help people into a future that they find better for themselves than the present that they're in or the past they came from. And MI offers a lot of possibilities for things you could explore and techniques we can use to do them and ways to communicate. But really, a lot of what I think about is all the stuff I'm leaving out and that I don't need to get into, you know, really complex psychological theory. I don't need to do skill training. And there's value in all these things, but that with an MI group, coming together, being together in a positive spirit, really giving our attention to each other in a compassionate way where we're really giving each other energy as they're speaking or as they're having difficulty speaking or just as they're present, and kind of all being together. There are things that there are details that will happen that will bring about positive change, but the essence is the most important part. There's no particular pathway out of the woods. We'll make one, you know, as a group that we can kind of work together in, and then each person will get out and kind of go do their own thing. But that sense of being in a space where we're not trying to pick apart what each other thinks or says or does, or, you know, why they've done things in the past or, you know, what they haven't done, but instead we're just simply trying to help each other find our way to a little better future, helps guide me.
In that spirit of helping each other, do you mind if I ask a sort of nuts and bolts question of the two of you?
Go for it.
So in the couples world, there are multiple schools of thought about combining individual and couple sessions. And there are really good clinicians who feel all sorts of ways about those things. I have generally taken the stance of only working with the couple together, with the rationale being that sometimes you can escape a difficult conversation by putting people in separate rooms and talking to them individually. But ultimately, the conflict that's emerging is something that they walk out the door with, even if I split them up. So I'm curious, as you two have been thinking about group work, so much of what you're talking about is the cultivation of cohesion and identity and this sort of collective momentum. I'm defaulting to the assumption that you are primarily imagining working with the group members only in the context of the group, and you're not doing individual sessions around the group activity. Am I correct in that, or where do you stand on that?
So I think Chris and I have had similar and also different experiences with this. Currently, my only clinical work is in the context of an HIV care clinic, where I do psychotherapy and counseling. And I also work with a substance use counselor, and we are doing a group which has at least one member already that I have seen individually, right? So, when that kind of thing happens, I think it's really important, at least for me, in my individual therapy with that person, I talked about this before it would happen. So that I wanted to, make sure that they knew that even though we had this individual relationship, this was going to be a different experience. And, to make sure that that was going to be okay, because individual therapy, you're focused literally only on that one person. And clearly in a group, I would have to be sharing my attention with other people too. And, I might seem different to the person I was working with when it's in a group context than an individual. So I think full disclosure, when possible, is just the best way to go, right? This particular person thought that it would be comfortable enough. But, had it not happened that way, then we would have had to make a choice. Maybe they wait until the next group convenes that I wasn't going to be a part of, or maybe we look for some other options.
Yeah, that was a great thought and question, Tyrel, because I was, as a facilitator, when I run groups, sort of my mantra, or my number one thing, not number one, but a top thing in my mind is I don't want to do individual therapy in a group setting. And I've seen people kind of go around the circle and do a little session with each person, and everybody else just kind of gets bored. I was reflecting back to the last groups I was running a few weeks ago, before kind of striking out on my own. I was working with men who had just come out of prison. And a lot of these guys were gang affiliated, histories of violence, just go down the list, right? And so, put them in a group of about nine fellows. And, the opening group, I don't care what your opening question is, you're not going to get much. These are very non-disclosive men about how they feel. That vulnerability is a risk, because it can get used against you in prison and in this residential setting that I was working in. And so I implemented a lot of the structure that Chris and Karen talk about in motivational interviewing groups, because it gave them something to do. And the first thing I was trying to do with them is to do the linking that Chris had showed me, with the importance of that. And, we talked about what's important to them, and what do they want for the future, to kind of build a little momentum. And, found common denominators between people and between the group. And pretty much everyone in the group said what they don't want is to go back to prison. So then we could start a conversation moving forward about how not to do that. But all the while we're building cohesion, where maybe 2 sessions later, somebody takes more of a risk and they talk about their marriage, or they talk about, how I haven't seen my kids in 7 years. And then I find, am I really helpful in this setting? Because as I'm sitting there, and you both have talked about it, is that people are at different places, whether they're in a couple or in a group. And it's like you can externalize the ambivalence that's in the room. And you can start working with it, and you can say, well, it seems like, you 3 guys are really interested in working towards making change in your life. And some of these other folks are kind of sitting on the fence, and maybe get them to have a conversation with each other about where they're at and why they're there. But I mean, I kind of look at the group as one lieu of a better word, organism. And it's particularly as they become more cohesive. And the couple's kind of the same way, you know. It's great. I like what you said, that I want to keep drinking, but I don't want you to drink. That's a very common thing in couples therapy. You know, and how do you resolve that ambivalence that the relationship is holding? So those are the thoughts that you guys have been kind of creating in my head. Steve, what were you gonna say?
Yeah, just when I listen to Joel and Tyrel, I wonder, like, what's MI about this? You know, what is the contribution of MI to the way you're speaking about your work? And I don't think it's a bad thing at all if MI, you know, dissolves and integrates with other approaches at all. So I'm not presenting an orthodox purist argument, but I do wonder, and how about this from a kind of a naive standpoint of somebody who isn't an MI group therapist, that what was special about MI was avoiding confronting people and solving people's problems for them, because that generates kickback, and framing resistance as a relational problem, and doing everything we can to help people evoke their best ideas about how they want to change from them. If that's like, I don't know, but then I think Karen makes a comment, like thinking about groups, that there's always one or two people in the group. Well, Karen, that is like, goes on worldwide in every setting. There isn't a manager or a sports coach who hasn't told me. In fact, I met an elite sports coach recently, whom I mentor, who lost his job because there were 2 or 3 people at the beginning of his stint in this club who were troublemakers, and he never managed to deal with them, and they undermined what he did, and he lost his job. So these are naturally occurring chaotic exchanges where the manager, coach, whomever, is having individual chats with people in the corridor all the time. And I am struggling, and I love it, and I'm enjoying it. I'm struggling to make sense of, well, how do you take those very special qualities of MI to help that manager, that coach, that teacher? And I hope it's not as, you know, I'm not suggesting you answer it. I'm just throwing out a puzzle there. But trying to hold on dearly to the unique bits that MI really does contribute. And I think I've tried to articulate what they are. But maybe I'm goofy and gone feral, and I have had a couple of glasses of wine and smoke and, you know,
so despite the couple of glasses of wine and the smoke, I think you do raise a good point, and I think it's interesting. It's interesting, and I think helpful to me to have somebody push on this a little bit, because I think on some level I'm tempted to respond to you and say, well, of course it's MI. But then I have to pause and think about, like, what is that based on, other than just what I'd love to tell you. But I think there are a number of ways in which at least what I'm doing with couples is uniquely MI. And one is that I have really tried, by using O'Leary's work, who really like sort of took what Rogers was doing in individual humanistic psychotherapy and talked about how those humanistic ideals that Rogers discussed are manifest in humanistic couples therapy. I've really tried to bring that client-centered orientation into the entire framework for working with couples. I think Emma raised a really great question, which is, you know, what happens when you discover in the course of working with a couple that ultimately they don't want to be in this relationship anymore. And my answer to your question, Emma, is you do, in my mind, that is a great place to think about the stance of equipoise, because as I tell my trainees, it's not your job to keep these folks together, and it's not your job to break them up. right? It is your job to help them, think about the best relationship they can realize, to consider how long they want to keep doing this. And if ultimately they decide they don't want to do it anymore, then each of them continues to be an autonomous individual who gets to make that choice. And we could potentially help them think about how to end this relationship in ways that minimize unnecessary emotional pain and suffering. So I think those humanistic elements are maybe they haven't been fully highlighted in what we've been talking about. But I think that's really a big component of what we're doing. And I want to believe that in the same way that we might think of discord or reactance as a relational problem, I also think that part of what we're doing in thinking about cohesion and the centrality of cohesion and the bonding of group membership with individual identity, that in a way we're expanding the concept of discord so that it encompasses not just the relationship each of the people has with the counselor, but the relationship that they have with one another. And that on some level, what we're doing is mitigating discord between the couple or within the group and facilitating a stronger relationship, which is almost sort of a working alliance among the people in these groups. So I don't know, maybe that's wishful thinking, but I want to believe that there is something truly MI in this yet.
So Steve, I was sitting reflecting on your question, and it's a really good question. And I think in some ways you answered it for me, because I think what MI, and whether it's individual, group, or practice, it gives me, it helps inform my thinking about being with people in a helpful way to make them change and the change process. And so the thing that initially grabbed me about motivational interviewing, coming from the addictions field, is a non-confrontational, kind of therapeutically aggressive approach. And I think, thinking about engaging and working with people in a different kind of way that's more collaborative and less expert driven, and then having some skills around how to facilitate that conversation and some things to listen for and how to interact with those things is really helpful. It's a way of thinking about change that's probably been most impactful in my practice.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting perhaps to hear what Chris and Karen say, because they've heard us ranting and raving about cutting across context. God, we've heard about Timothy Leary, we've like coaches. I mean, poor souls, yet there's a certain essence that I pick up in Chris and Karen's work that feels very exciting in its potential to help people outside the therapy world. But I wonder what Chris and Karen make of all this divergent ranting.
Well, I don't think it's ranting, but as y'all were talking, what kept coming up to me was, when I'm doing MI training, the whole spirit of MI piece. And that's where I think more than a specific technique, I think the MI groups and the MI with couples is very consistent with MI and is full of MI. I mean, it's evocative rather than telling, I know better than you, right? It's accepting, especially in a group context. I'm going to go in assuming and accepting that people in the group are going to be in wildly different places in terms of readiness for change, interest in change, why they're in the group, who sent them there, all of that. So I'm going to enter with that spirit of acceptance, that I can see you as you are now and be comfortable with that, even if I could see there's a long road to go, right? And I'm going to try to collaborate with you and form a partnership. not just with each member of the group, but also with the group as a whole. I'm going to try to be a good partner for them and be a good collaborator for them. And then finally, you know, all throughout the work in groups is the construct of compassion, right? And how I always describe compassion if I'm doing training is it's seeing someone suffering and offering them some solace, right? It's offering them, I can see you're suffering. I'm not going to try to fix it, but I can see it and acknowledging it. And that very definitely happens in a group. And oftentimes, once the group gets rolling a bit, it happens between the members, where someone will tell an awful story or a very sad thing that happened, and other members are welling up with tears, or, you know, one will reach over and pat the other ones on the knee, you know, to try to like just say, I'm here for you. That compassion is all through the way we do the groups with the MI spirit.
Yeah, I've really appreciated compassion coming to the forefront in MI. I think it could be the most important thing any of us do, helping one another. So how am I? So Steve, I think of MI as like there is the piece of direction without directivity, whatever. I should have thought of that. But anyway, that, you know, focusing on forward movement without telling somebody which way to go and how to get there. The bit of warmth that's in MI without over involvement, that you're there and you're with somebody, but it's not necessarily, you can meet somebody where they are, but you're not getting in their situation with them. And again, getting over involved. And there's also a lightness to MI that doesn't, it's not like a toxic positivity to me where you can't go to deep and difficult things, but it doesn't push people there if that's not really what's going to be helpful for them in the moment of kind of moving forward towards, you know, the future that they want. So those are the pieces, some of the pieces that guide me when we're working together. And generally within a group, I'm trying to get everybody to kind of get on board with those ideas. And so a group that seems really different on the surface or initially, I'm really looking for similarities and ties to pull them together. And then other groups that at the outset seem really homogeneous because they're defined as a group to come and deal with a particular problem. I'm looking for the heterogeneity, the differences, the divergence and diversity in people so that we don't get caught in groupthink. Tipping, you know, the issue of culture has been raised here, and it's such a big issue to think about. And you know, I would love if we could bring some people forward. You know, there have been lots of interesting comments. So I don't know, I'm not trying to run your webcast for you, but I don't know if we have time to do that.
Well, we got lots of time. I mean, it just depends on how much time everybody has. Kendall, we'll start organizing that, and we'll ask, you know, if anybody wants to come on and talk for sure and share. Kendall, what have you been writing stuff down? So what's going on in your mind?
No, I'm a right little note taker, aren't I? I'm just trying to get it out of my head. I think, I mean, it's such a rich conversation, isn't it? And I'm learning so much by everything. And I keep thinking about the similarities between using MI with individuals and the similarities between using it with groups and within couples. And even when you're working in therapeutic groups, and also when you're working training MI. And I'm really trying to reflect on the similarities of that. And I guess what came up for me and what I wrote down was Steve, actually, years ago when we were working in Wales once, he was saying, I think he used the expression that we should be like going from being little dormice or mice to big birds of prey. I think you may have told me this even, Chris, as well once, and that when we're doing like reflections to summaries, that we're coming up and going quite meta. And what I find fascinating is the sense of the evocation and the empowerment process. Often I find when I go meta, that can be a beautiful transition from focus to evocation, be that within groups or within individuals. And what I mean by doing that is by summarizing and identifying, this is where I think we are, where do you think we are? And what I love about MI is it is that bringing everybody into the space with you. So you're not the expert. Chris, you were saying there's too many experts. And where MI, I think, is beautiful is it holds everybody in that adult space. And isn't it that sense of, okay, well, if I'm going meta, then I'm also inviting you to decide what we do next. And saying, you know, okay, well, this is where we've come, and where are we as a group, and where are we as a couple? What's going on here? Let's just slow it down. What's going on, and what's going to be the most helpful? Now, I'll do that with individuals, and I'll do that with my groups, and say when we're falling into maybe a negative trap, or we're all getting stuck, or, you know, and I might say, okay, I'm just going to slow it down and press pause. Where do we all think we are? And so from an MI perspective, I think that's where what I'm taking is that it allows that empowerment and evocation, not just around behavior change, but it's also an invitation to be intentional about what choices we're making around change or about the journey towards change. And yeah, that's the little things that I've been writing down along the way.
Beautiful.
Well, and I'd like to build on something you said, Kendall. I think that's really useful, that sometimes in a group, members are talking and going kind of around the circle and sharing something. And maybe as a facilitator, you're doing some simple reflection here, or maybe a complex reflection there. And part of what we do with that to address the group as a whole is to make sort of a reflection at the group level, right? It feels like people are starting to get really comfortable with each other because I'm hearing a lot of more intimate details coming out. You're starting to trust each other. I'll name that, right? And it's funny. I think of it like a little group of kindergarten kids. All of a sudden they'll kind of giggle and beam, and there's that moment of more connection, like, oh yeah, we are in it together, because you did that sort of summary reflection, right? Yeah,
it is. It's a way of threading and using that process. And I think that can be similar in couples when you're trying to create that connection and the threading as well, and moving them to being a unit to decide what decisions they make together out, within their own political system as well.
Right. So that phenomena absolutely happens. We talk about it as like dyadic reflections, dyadic questions, relationship affirmations. They're things that are said to the couple and that encompass content that is relevant to both people in the relationship. I think this work has been done with groups. There's certainly been a lot of couples communication work that has examined the way people use pronouns. And when a couple speaks in the third person, when they talk about we and I, it actually is associated with how close they feel to one another. And so interestingly, if as a counselor, we can speak to them as a third person unit, it potentially then catalyzes that same sense of connectedness. So one of the things that I always loved about MI is that it was one of the first times where I felt like I had a really precise way of thinking about language. And I think there's an opportunity to bring some of this really interesting work that has been done around how couples speak about themselves and what we can tell from just the way they use pronouns, that potentially then informs the way we speak to them. There's something that has been said several times, and I see this on the couple side in I think a way that is at least in tonic with what you're talking about in groups, which is that part of the value, part of what the couples seem to get out of this is the opportunity to speak with one another. Now, what may happen more in couples than it does in your groups is that the therapy session or the counseling session launches a conversation that they then continue outside of the time together. But you're setting I think the longer I've done this, the more I have begun to think that the purpose of the counseling session is to set something in motion. And that the echo of that, or that ongoing momentum, is going to result in things happening between sessions. And those things are not arbitrary or accidental. That's actually part of the benefit. Like, that is part of what makes this useful, is the launching of an internal way of thinking, and the launching of a conversation that like in many cases, couples will say, we've been trying to talk about this for a long time and we couldn't figure out how to get it started. So I think you see that on this side as well.
That makes a lot of sense to me, and I want to expand that just a little bit. I think you'd probably agree with this, not just setting in motion or launching, but even setting free to get back into motion. That there are things that we have to remember were already happening before we came into the play with somebody, and they've gotten stuck, and it's just kind of helping get some obstacles out of their way at times. And thinking about the language, so I want to get back to a little bit of, I think it was Steve's question about what is MI in a group. Some of it is, Karen, I've been thinking about it, is just broadening our definition of change talk a little bit, or I don't know if broadening is the right word, but change talk, I often, like, my first thought with change talk is usually go to change talk about something specific. And my head wants to get into the situation of the specific thing that somebody's talking about. And one-on-one, that makes perfectly good sense. It's a good place to start. In groups, well, you know, as Karen talked about, and you also talked about, doing dyadic or group reflections is very useful. But for me, even doing individual reflection, keeping out details and just kind of getting to the essence of, like, if you think about change talk categories, the darn cat, my mind might want to go to desire for something, as instead just stick with the desire and reflect, you know, you're really wanting this for yourself, or you feel like it's a time when, you know, your back's to the wall and there's a change that, you know, is kind of just around the corner for you. Sorry, mixed metaphors there, right? And leaving out those details about the individual situation is a way to keep everybody working inside their head. That a lot of what we're trying to do with people is, Karen has often referred to it, what do you say, Karen, not do interviewing with witnesses, individual sessions with witnesses. Is keeping everybody involved and kind of staying generic or general in my reflections, and trying to set them up so that even if somebody's not talking, they're going through a change journey in their head. And I'm sure many of you who do couples or group work have had this happen, where somebody won't say anything, but then they'll come out towards the end of a session and say, at the beginning, here's where I'm at, and here's where, after listening to people, I've been inspired, and here's what I've been thinking and where I've come to. And that's one of the things I really like about group work, is we don't have to go through, we don't even have to revisit what they went through in their head. Just jump in, kind of helicopter into where they are at the moment, and then use that as a springboard to go back out to the group and keep building that group energy.
Yeah, Chris, I don't know where I got this from. It might have been you, or I might have made it up. Was this, but I definitely got it from reading you and watching you and Karen. Was this idea of blowing a balloon up, that you gently blow a balloon up. This was how I imagined you, and I've watched you work. So blow a balloon up and toss it out, in the hope that they will toss this balloon around among themselves, because it's gentle and it's thoughtful and it's got lightness and air and it's evocative. And if it pops, which is the equivalent of, you know, something going wrong, you just take another balloon and blow it up, and it's got a different color, maybe some different words on it, and throw it back out. And I always found that very, yeah, I don't know who came up with that idea, but I found it helpful to think about constructive conversation in a group along those lines.
I like that.
Let me just pause for 1 second, just because we're at 90 minutes, and that's what I'd requested. We'd offered you guys. I'm happy to keep going. That's fine with me. We often do, and people stick around or they trail off. But I just want to kind of acknowledge that, you know, you've done your friendly contractual obligation to join us. And I want to keep going. Steve, I think you ought to have another glass of wine. You know, we got you talking about balloons. I want to know what's next. But you know, one of the things I was thinking, Chris, when you were talking was about when I participated as a participant in a group therapy experience for a year, and how much internal processing is going on for me when other people are working through their own stuck places or the stuff they're trying to work through, because I'm thinking about them in relation to me. And it, you know, even if things are still in quiet, there's still activity going on underneath the surface.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really one of the big benefits of a group, I think, for treatment, because there's only so much one can do as an individual therapist with that person that will keep the person percolating throughout the next week. But in a group of peers, the member comes to see the other people in the group as their peers, right? And they're much more open to letting their peers' ideas percolate, and you know, they might expand on something, and the next week, sure enough, a couple of members come back and say, hey, when so-and-so said this, it got me started to think about this, and here's what I did. And then somebody else will chime in. And that's when the beauty of group work really shows, right? And setting up those conditions where people feel safe to share, I am moving forward in my journey, and acknowledge the contributions of the other group members. You're golden then. As the leader, you can pretty much sit back and relax because things are moving on their own now.
That may be the group analog of the phenomena that I see when a couple comes in and says, this week we talked a lot about this thing that you brought up last week, where there's something that they've carried forward and continue to sort of ruminate on or chew on in the space between. If what might help us pivot a little bit to the conversation about culture, and also fits with what you were saying, Joel, I have realized something that is has been really salient to me in training people to work with couples, which is that I have sometimes seen counselors who are, you know, really good at maintaining a non-judgmental stance in the room with one individual, and you put them in a room with a couple, and all of a sudden they get thrown off because we all have opinions about what a good relationship looks like and what a good partner should do and what is acceptable and unacceptable as a way to treat the people that you're with, and how you should be obligated to take care of your children and your family and whatever, right? Like we all sort of have those beliefs. And I have seen people who are very, very good at holding sort of their heart in one hand and the clients in the other when they're in the room with one person, but put them in a room with a couple, and they actually have to see that argument begin to play out, or they watch what one person says to the other in real time. And all of a sudden they get activated in whole new sorts of ways. So I have found actually a fair amount of time in training and supervision spent allowing the counselor to sort of unpack their own beliefs about what good relationships look like and what good partners and parents and whatever do, and to then sort of practice perspective taking and to imagine what their clients in the context that their clients are in, then like how do they make sense of these same things? So I've seen a sort of a new or an additional level of that work that I'm often doing with trainees.
For me personally, I've long ago realized I'll never be perfect and I'll never do a perfect session. And one thing that's been helpful is kind of the freedom that comes with in a group of people. There are always going to be some people who respond positively, some people who check out, and some people who respond negatively. And that, I think Kendall was talking about this earlier, the important thing about just including everybody in the room, whatever experience you're having, you know, is there, and it helps me to not have those kind of writing reflexes that you're talking about, or at least that's how I think of them. To know that I don't have to save people from each other. I mean, I do have a responsibility to do some protection at times. That's a whole other topic that we could get into. You know, but that my attention is more on making it a good environment for a group, helping, you know, get the group conversation going. And then I like that balloon thing. Now I'm going to have that balloon idea in my mind, you know, popping that around, you know, and that I think I learned one time, like what I thought was really one of the best group sessions I ever was involved in. And it wasn't me, it was just such an amazing group, resulted in somebody leaving the group and not coming back and leaving upset. And it was a matter of people really giving this human being love, I think, that she had not experienced. And the way I walked away from it and kind of found a way to be okay with it is, you know, it was too much for her. She couldn't process and kind of come back because so much of her other surroundings were disappointing and, you know, had led her to difficulties with attachment. But I'm hoping that, you know, as some time went by, she could look back and see, you know, that moment is something that she would like to have more of. Because I'm really convinced, you know, I record sessions and I went back and looked at that one multiple times to say, did I miss a microaggression? Did I miss somebody doing something that maybe didn't register for me? And all I saw was love. And even that sometimes is not in the moment what, again, I don't want to say it's not what somebody needed or wasn't helpful, but it wasn't something that she could continue on with at that moment. I realize that went off from what you were talking about, but
just to add to that, I mean, sometimes when somebody's experienced trauma, compassion can be seen as a threat, you know, and as a group facilitator with MI, sometimes somebody's behavior of being really non-judgmental and being truly in MI and being with somebody can be threatening because they're not used to that sense of it being without a transaction or a reason that can be quite negative. Mm-hmm. And that power of the group and, you know, and so, you know, Chris, you're such a seasoned trainer that you would pick up on something, I suspect, quicker than anybody out there. And
yeah, I think there's so many things like, is this real? Is this, you know, I'm sorry to use the word love. I'm sure there are more professional words, but is this love I'm experiencing real? And now that I've felt it, what happens if I really want this and this group doesn't continue and I don't have this elsewhere? Am I going to be even in more pain?
Wow.
Or how can I go forward into my life that's quite difficult and not be the only beacon of hope? You know, that's sometimes it is too much for someone to carry and continue on with a group or with a couples therapist. Frankly, sometimes the couples therapy process shines too harsh a light. Not that the therapy is harsh, but that inside one member of the couple may be recognizing, uh-oh, this is not working, and it's just too scary.
Can I
Steve.
ask you a question, Kendall, or anybody? If when I listen to Tyrel, it's clear that his stance in couples work is neutral, and everybody's nodding their heads, and I absolutely can see that. Okay, when I listen to Chris and Karen and I read their work and I think about how they work, they're not neutral. They're in favor of growth, and they're trying to generate momentum and forward momentum in a group. And in that sense, they're not neutral. They will be selectively highlighting things that people are saying that are in favor of growth and development and tossing the balloon back. So there might be a bit of a, not a problem, but we might need to think about couples work and group work a little differently here. Just a thought.
Although I haven't heard the couples to be neutral as much as not getting in the middle of somebody else's argument, maybe. Oh, looks like you're going to share with us directly.
Well, so I guess there are, in my mind, sort of two different issues at hand. Couples work is, at least as I imagine couples motivational interviewing to be, is neutral with respect to whether these two people should remain in a relationship. Because I think to begin from the outset with the notion that it is good if they stay together and bad if they break up, or the reverse, becomes somewhat coercive. So in that sense, it is quite neutral. I don't know that couples MI is any more neutral than MI with an individual is with respect to change. That we would assume that we're not here to dictate change, but to the extent that someone identifies a goal and something that they wish to work towards, we're then going to be selective in the way we attend to speech around that. I think I may not have a very, I'm probably guilty of not having a very romantic way of talking about couples work per se, but so much of what I imagine when I think about, facilitating dyadic functioning or drawing out what people value or what works about a relationship is that you're laying the foundation for change. You're laying the foundation for these people to ideally be able to reach consensus about where they want to go and then move in that direction more successfully. So I think without a doubt, I do in a full-throated way think we need to be neutral about whether the couple stays together. But I don't necessarily know that there is a particular mandate for neutrality around potentiating change or attending to change talk.
Can I step in and add to that as well? And then Chris, I can see you've unmuted. And
I was just going to tell him I feel smarter just listening to him. So that's all. You have the same effect on me. So I love
No. I do the opposite. That's the thing. but I think Steve's point about neutrality and Tyrel, there was something that came up for me as well around that, was that Steve, with MI, when we're looking at ambivalence as well, often when couples come in, they're almost both sides to the ambivalence. And in a way, part of MI can be about resolving the ambivalence within the couple. And, Tyrel's right about, maybe we're staying neutrality about what the ending of that relationship is or what the journey of that relationship looks like. But from an MI perspective, it sits very comfortably with me about you've come in here because you've got stuck, just like a human comes to me individually because they've got stuck. And MI is a wonderful navigation tool around that. From my side, that's what I was thinking when you brought that up. I don't know what you think, Steve. You're shaking your head. You're like, that's a load of crap, Kendall, just shut up.
No, I rather just reflect about what you're saying. Okay. I hear what you're saying. Yeah. And I suspect it's not a dichotomy. You're either directional or you're neutral. I think that's been a big problem in the MI field. I suspect that it's more like a knob that gets more and less neutral and changes moment to moment as well. So when I think of it like that, and I think that matches the reality probably quite well, it becomes very difficult to say, whoa. You know what I mean? It's difficult to distill or to generalize about it because it's a really nuanced business. I've swung backwards and forwards in terms of my aspirations for the other person in the space of 5 minutes, So Yeah. So it's nuanced, eh? It's nuanced.
What I found interesting as well about this is the sense of how couples work that Tyrel's talking about links to us being facilitators within groups. In a way, when we're working with couples around relational injuries, when we're working with people around trying to create that connection, as facilitators, you're also identifying relational injuries that have happened. And it came up, Chris, when you were talking about the person, you know, who it wasn't right for, and that you had to reflect on whether something had happened or whether that was just their journey. And almost in a way, as being a group facilitator, you're also a couples therapist, but more of a relational therapist, because you're working constantly with potential threats and injuries to the cohesion of it. And so you're using those similar techniques. Does that resonate with you, Karen, Chris, anyone?
Well, how about if I turn the volume up a little bit more and kind of with Margot's sort of postings on the thing. So what if it's a family of 5 and the family's really stuck, and now we don't have 2 people in intimate relationship with each other. Now we have 5 people in the intimate relationship with each other. And where does MI fit with that? And I haven't done family therapy to any degree since becoming knowledgeable and able to do motivational interviewing. But wow, that's a whole nother kettle of fish.
Yeah, I'd hope that would be a part of this conversation, but it certainly seems like a conversation you could have in the future.
Yeah.
I know, thinking about groups, the family systems work and some of the internal family systems ideas have been helpful. Just to briefly go back to Kendall, and then I'll let it go. So one of the ego things I had to learn, like processing through that situation I described, is, you know, I have a bias that remaining in my group would be the best pathway for somebody who's in it. But she may have gotten everything she needed and moved on. I had to guess, you know, what happened and, you know, tell myself some stories to be okay with it. But you know, there's that. You know, I think about MI, this is a little bit of an aside from that, but as not necessarily teaching people skills to climb the mountain better, or, you know, giving them gas or steam to kind of power forward, as much as just helping people find a way that change feels more natural to them. And they're not fighting, you know, things inside themselves, and they're not fighting ideas that put in their head that might be good for other people, but don't really fit for them. And so, like with this woman, you know, her leaving the group may have been her, you know, moment of moving into sun and rainbows.
Of course it was.
My way of capturing that for myself, Chris, is that, like, ultimately we're responsible for the integrity of the process. We don't get to control its outcome.
Mm-hmm. Well
And
said.
that's true whether it's individual, couples, group, any kind of treatment, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the difference of, you know, talking with you, Tyrel, versus talking with the guy who's behind the bar at the pub. About my role.
That's probably true.
He's probably more invested in the outcome.
Well, so I think there's something that happens in couples work, it happens in individual work, but it's part of what makes any counseling exchange so different. And I think motivational interviewing captures this really beautifully. In ordinary discourse, we assume that when people speak in statements, they're going to tell us about them. And if they want to know about us, then they'll ask questions. But most people, just casually in ordinary conversations, when they speak in statements, they move the center of gravity in the conversation towards themselves. And I think one of the really remarkable things about motivational interviewing is that in the process of learning to do it, you learn to speak in statements, to make assertions without shifting the center of gravity towards yourself. And that I think is powerful for individuals. And when you do it for a group, you become the person potentially who verbalizes what these two people are for each other, or what this group holds in common. You become the holder of that consensus and cohesion.
I love what you're saying, Tyrel, and I was also distracted by Logan coming into the room.
I'm sorry to do that.
Hi, Logan.
In the real life, it's my turn to go be parent now, so I will probably have to go myself.
I should probably go as
okay.
well.
All right, we can wind it up here. That's fine. I mean, we've almost gone 2 hours, and I know speaking for Steve and Kendall, and Ange are really grateful for the time that you gave us. Yeah, you too, Logan. You too, buddy.
This was really fun. I'm glad that we got
great.
to do this together, Tyrel and Chris and you guys. Thanks for inviting us.
You're more than welcome,
Happy to
Karen.
do it.
Okay, well, maybe there'll be another time.
Well, good
Bye, everybody.
evening or good morning, whatever time it is where you are in the world.
Okay. Any closing thoughts before we disconnect from anybody?
Just thank you for opening up this space. I think there are many other conversations to have. The issue of culture got raised a few times, and I'm aware that it's so interrelated with any time we're trying to bring groups of people together.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation and for putting this together.
Cool.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you for
Steve,
all
any
your
parting words?
incredible hard work.
Bye-bye. Have a nice vacation, Steve.
Lovely to see your little girl, Chris. Lovely.
Yeah.
to see her.
Steve and Kendall, can you hang out for just
All
a
right.
second?
Yeah.
When we finish up.
Okay.
Bye. Bye,
Bye.
Logan. Bye, Leda.